Hey, it's Pat the Flip. Today I'll be reading On Protagonist Myths, Killing Your Joy, and Why I Still Compete in Fighting Games. If you liked this and found it useful, please share it with your friends and support me over at patreon.com/pattheflip. Free subscribers get all my stuff in their email inbox, and paying subscribers get to ask me questions. Thanks for your support. A wise friend once said, "I wish it was easier to explain how you must and will be a rock star at something is a promise no one made that's killing your joy." I love this because A, it is an extremely succinct summation of the pervasive funk surrounding so many hobby spaces, and B, it's true in the most literal sense, but also not entirely accurate, especially for directly competitive hobbies. It is certainly true that no one promised us we'd be great, but if we stop to think of all the stories we've consumed over our lives that involve someone overcoming adversity to have their rock star moment, I think it's easy to see why people would come into new hobbies with that in mind, especially competitive activities where, well, someone has to be the best, so why couldn't it be you? I have often said that buying a fighting game is in part buying the permission to daydream about becoming a champion, in the same way that buying a lottery ticket is in part buying the permission to daydream about being rich. It's easy for our brains to construct the training montage in your head that leads you to the gold, and that becomes a powerful image for sustaining us through the endless ranked grind sessions and such. However, for most of us, that temporary burst of enthusiasm runs out long before we're able to cultivate a reliable source of good feelings that let us keep it up sustainably. I've written more about this in Understanding Your Motivations and Finding Clean Fuel if you're interested. So, I figured this might be a good excuse to write a little bit about my own practice, nearly 2 decades in, to see how I avoided what we might as well call the protagonist trap. For starters, I have been good at video games since I was a little kid, but I have never entertained any illusions of being great. I am the same age as Justin Wong and Taquito, both of whom were winning EVOs basically around the time I started competing in fighting games. I wasn't even winning my locals, and the gap between myself and the upper tier of players, John Choi and Ricky Ortiz of course, but also the tier below them of guys who win if John and Ricky aren't there, felt large enough to be insurmountable. I couldn't even daydream of beating them because it felt so comically impossible that my brain wouldn't even bother to try imagining it. Crucially, that didn't dissuade me from continuing to play the games. I just figured that maybe, with enough time and practice, I'd be able to get good enough to lose to the greats in grands instead of at the beginning of the tournament. I played these games because they were fun and took me to meet interesting people in interesting places, not because I planned on one day winning something. I also had no illusion at the time that being the best in the world at a fighting game would lead to any kind of material success. Winning EVO was worth maybe a grand or something, and no one was paying any real bills with it back then. So I kept on playing fighting games, but I also did a lot of other stuff, including getting into Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and mixed martial arts. Getting into combat sports in 2004, right before The Ultimate Fighter brought the UFC into contention as a staple of mostly American young men's sports entertainment, was kind of like getting into fighting games before the Street Fighter IV boom in 2009. It was niche but growing, especially in Southern California, which is where I went to school. I started training in an on-campus PE class led by a local cage fighter who went on to win the WEC championship and later have a shot at the UFC. The craft of MMA combat had not yet been thoroughly polished and athleticized to its current state, and it seemed like anyone who was young enough to not really have anything else going on, and willing enough to put their time and health on the line could reasonably have a shot at a pro career. I fell in love with it and became a jock practically overnight, training whenever I could, hitting the gym in between, maxing macros at the campus cafeteria, and watching any UFC or Pride cards I could get my hands on, trying to learn more about how to fight. Like fighting games, the relative proximity to the professional players made the gap between us immediately apparent. I wasn't even the strongest fighter in my PE classes, but whenever I had a chance to spar with a professional fighter, or even a professional coach, it was a fantastic reminder of all the amazing things human beings can do with singular focus and devotion, greatness that I could one day maybe aspire to experience a fraction of if I were willing to make similar sacrifices myself. As with fighting games, I never held any illusions of becoming a champion. However, unlike fighting games in the 2000s, martial arts had room for people to make a living. Prize fighting wasn't a great deal on its own unless you were the best of the best, but plenty of fighters were able to use their professional runs to build their own gym businesses, sell instructional DVDs, teach paid seminars, that kind of thing. So, after finishing college, I gave myself a couple years to go as hard as I could on fighting and see what kind of career I might be able to get from it. That included a year in Japan on a government research fellowship grant that I used to train in Nagoya, and another year going hard on competitive Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu while also juggling teaching youth boxing and BJJ classes. I loved those years, but I did not love being broke during a recession or underinsured while getting choked and slammed and punched nearly every day. So when I saw a chance for full-time stable office work doing something I didn't hate, consumer tech journalism, I took it, telling myself that it'd be better for me to work days and train nights anyway. It was. I did manage to continue training and competing for a few more years, though not quite at the same volume as before the day job, but I also found that I liked being a professional writer and editor a lot more than I thought I would, and that I did just fine in professional creative environments. I was good at my job, got promoted, got better jobs, and settled into fighting as a hobby. And as I got a little more life experience and perspective, I realized that the thing that really stuck with me was that the professional fighters and coaches and gym owners weren't any happier than the professional writers or editors or anyone else I knew from my office life. If anything, they were generally less happy. Any joy they got from being able to practice and teach martial arts for a living was outweighed by the stress of running a business and dealing with customers and constantly nursing injuries. Maybe at one point in their journey, they too had a moment where they had to decide if they were serious about it enough to go all in. But I think most of them did it because they had to. And while I knew I loved martial arts, I also knew that I had other choices in life and that my best shot at a happy, fulfilling life was not to be found in going pro. I think that this is the truth that some sports stories tell well and others don't. In Hajime no Ippo, we get to see Ippo fall in love with boxing as a young man. He boxes, and he helps run his family's fishing boat business, and we never see him inclined to do literally anything else with himself. Obsession isn't just a thing that you have, it's also the other things you don't have, which would compete for your time and attention. The vast majority of us aren't protagonists of our own sports stories because we're complete, complicated individuals with more going on than just boxing or Street Fighter or whatever. And we are, generally speaking, far happier because of it. Obsession rarely leaves room for joy. I do not have that kind of obsession within me. I love fighting, real and virtual, and it will be part of me forever. But I do not possess the single-minded dedication it takes to achieve true world-class competitive greatness, the kind it would take to pay my bills at least. And I have no interest in cultivating it because it wouldn't make me any happier. Funnily enough, my initial career trajectory as guy who fights good enough to open a decent gym ended up mirroring my fighting game career trajectory as guy who plays fighting games good enough to leverage that expertise in game development and moonlight as a teacher on the side, which has worked out far better than I could have ever expected to do in martial arts. What I have instead of that obsession is the quiet dedication of the hobbyist. I clock out of my job, eat dinner, and clock in at my fun desk, where I put in my hour or two for the night before feeding the cats and going to bed. I'm not here because I have to be. I'm here because I don't want to be anywhere else. I think of myself as equal parts inspiration and cautionary tale. Look at me, kids. You too can spend 20 years playing these games to be just good enough to lose to the real greats. Being a protagonist is exhausting, but being a side character is a pretty sweet gig. I get to have my moment of looking cool, even in defeat, then go home to sleep in a big bed with my wife. Mine is not the story that will get you into fighting games or whatever else your shit is, but it might be a story that helps you stick with it. Thanks for listening.
You have finished the final round. Player 1 falls back a lower rank. This is Nancy's report. Try next play.